Later that same evening, the weight of anticipation hung thick in the air as Wamba stood in the grand Manjo Hall. His fingers nervously traced the hem of his traditional initiation robe, the fabric heavy on his shoulders. The other new students shifted beside him, their wide eyes scanning the surroundings, whispering in hushed tones. The hall itself was a marvel, its stone walls adorned with ancient carvings, the ceiling towering above like a night sky filled with the stories of generations past. But tonight, none of that mattered. The beauty of the hall was lost on them. Tonight, there was only one thing on everyone's mind: the initiation. The rite of passage was shrouded in mystery and laced with fear, a test that every student had to endure. For Wamba, this night was more than a challenge. It was his chance to prove that he belonged. Ever since Prince Danso had ripped the crown from his head in front of everyone, whispers had followed him like a shadow. A street rat turned prince? How could he ever measure up? Though many students had been kind, their smiles concealed the doubt beneath. He could feel it. And tonight, he had to silence those doubts, not just for them, but for himself. Wamba's heart raced as the grand doors to the hall swung open. He turned along with the others to see the older students enter. They moved with a slow, deliberate pace, dressed in flowing traditional cloaks that caught the flicker of torchlight. Their expressions were hard, focused, like seasoned warriors marching to battle. And among them, to Wamba's dismay, was Prince Danso. His stomach clenched. Danso's gaze slid over him with that familiar look of challenge. Wamba felt his skin prickle under the weight of it. This couldn't end well. He could feel it in his bones. The night was only going to get harder. The older students lined up before them, the initiation about to begin. Each newcomer was to be paired with an older student, someone to shadow them through the trial. The task was simple: venture into the dark forest behind the school and retrieve a hidden item. They had 2 hours. It sounded straightforward, but Wamba knew better. Success tonight meant more than just passing the initiation. It meant acceptance into the school's inner circle, a key to alliances that would shape their future. Failure, however, was a different story. It wasn't just about not making it. Failure meant being cast out of that circle, excluded from the bonds that would secure his future in a world where power, influence, and royalty were everything. The consequences would haunt anyone who didn't succeed, marking them as outsiders. As the pairings began, Wamba's pulse quickened, excitement bubbling inside him. The air was thick with tension, but all he could focus on was the thrill of the challenge ahead. His heart raced with the thought of making his dads proud, of proving that he truly belonged here. This was his moment to shine, his chance to show everyone that he was worthy of the crown. The rush of adrenaline surged through him, pushing aside any doubts. He was ready. But when his name was called to be paired with a senior student, his heart sank. From the shadows, Prince Danso stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Wamba's. "I'll take him," Danso said, his voice cool, but with an edge of disdain. A wave of silence swept through the hall. Wamba felt the room close in around him. Danso's friends exchanged puzzled looks. Prince Danso never participated in the hazing rituals. Bewildered, one of them asked, "Why now, Danso? You never do this." Danso's smile deepened, the challenge in his eyes unmistakable. "He's a pauper pretending to be a prince. Let's see if he has what it takes to be one of us, although I doubt it. He'll struggle," he said calmly. "I'm just here to make sure the unworthy don't slip through." The words stung, leaving Wamba's chest tight with frustration. He felt the heat rising in his cheeks, but he kept his expression neutral, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'll prove him wrong," Wamba thought, every muscle in his body tense with determination. He wouldn't let Danso win, not tonight. The air between them vibrated with tension, a silent, electric charge that neither of them could ignore. It felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them, caught in a battle of wills. I'll show him. As they entered the forest, the oppressive darkness swallowed them whole. The moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy of trees above, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Each pair was given only one torch, but even its flickering light seemed useless against the weight of the night. Wamba walked ahead, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the hidden item that would prove his worth. Behind him, like a shadow, was Prince Danso, his presence heavy and unsettling. The silence between them wasn't just cold, it was frigid. Wamba could feel Danso's gaze burning into his back, as though the prince was willing him to fail with every step. He knew Danso wasn't here to ensure fairness. No, he was here to sabotage him, to make sure he failed. And the first act of sabotage came quickly. As they navigated a narrow path, Wamba heard the unmistakable clatter of the torch as it tumbled into the abyss below. He turned just in time to see Prince Danso smirking in the darkness. "Oh no," Prince Danso said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "How clumsy of me." Wamba's jaw tightened, frustration boiling under his skin. "Stay calm," he told himself. "Don't let him get to you." He forced himself to focus, relying on the dim moonlight to guide him, but his patience was wearing thin. It didn't stop there. Every step Wamba took, Danso was there, making the journey harder. He shoved Wamba into brambles, whispered taunts into his ear, and deliberately blocked his path. Torchlights dotted the forest in the distance, students moving through the trees as laughter and conversations drifted around them, oblivious to the tension between Wamba and Danso. But Wamba pressed on, determined not to let Danso win. His body ached from the constant sabotage, his muscles burning as he struggled to stay focused. With each shove and taunt, his resolve wavered. The 2-hour window was closing fast, and he had made no progress. Finally, Wamba had enough. He spun around, his chest heaving, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "What is your problem with me?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the stillness of the forest. "Why do you hate me so much?" Prince Danso's smirk faltered just for a moment before he quickly regained control. His sneer, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was sharp as a blade. "Hate you?" he scoffed. "You think I care enough to hate you? You're nothing. Street scum playing dress-up. You'll never belong here, and I'll make sure of it." Wamba's fists clenched, his body trembling with the urge to hit him. He had promised Kwame he wouldn't let Danso get to him, but that promise felt impossible to keep now. He stepped closer, their faces inches apart, his heart pounding with fury. He was ready to snap. But before the punch could land, the ground beneath them shifted. In an instant, both boys tumbled down a narrow ravine, their bodies colliding as they fell. The world spun around them, leaves and dirt flying in all directions. They landed in a cramped space, their bodies tangled together, pressed chest to chest. Their faces were so close that Wamba could feel Danso's breath against his skin. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was thick, suffocating. Wamba's heart raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. The warmth of Danso's body against his was overwhelming, the tension between them unbearable. Fear gripped him, not just the fear of being trapped in this small, tight space, but the fear of what this closeness was doing to him. He tried to shift away from Danso, to create some distance, but the cramped space only caused their bodies to press even closer together with every movement. Wamba could feel the tension between them, their bodies uncomfortably close in the tight space. He was acutely aware of Danso's presence, the tension between them heightening in the enclosed space. His thoughts spiraled, emotions betraying him with every moment of closeness. Without thinking, Wamba reached out, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed gently against Danso's cheek. His heart pounded with confusion, but his hand acted on its own accord. The moment his fingers touched Danso's skin, a spark ran through him, igniting something deep inside. Wamba could barely breathe, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. He had wanted this for so long, and now, with the prince so close, the feelings he had been avoiding became undeniable. Danso stiffened at Wamba's touch, his breath hitching. His mind screamed at him to pull away, to push Wamba back. But he couldn't. The intensity between them was too much, the weight of everything they had buried crashing down like a flood. He told himself that he hated Wamba, that Wamba was not fit to touch him, but his body reacted differently. Their eyes locked, both of them breathing heavily, and something shifted between them. In one swift motion, Wamba closed the distance, his lips pressing against Danso's with sudden urgency. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was charged, filled with emotions they had fought against for so long. Emotions neither of them understood. Wamba kissed Danso like he had been holding back for too long, his hands gripping Danso's shirt, pulling him closer. Danso, stunned for only a heartbeat, responded with the same intensity. His hands moved instinctively, one gripping the back of Wamba's neck, the other pulling him closer by the waist. The kiss was filled with everything they had tried to suppress. For a moment, the world faded away, leaving only the two of them. The kiss deepened, their lips moving together. Wamba's heart pounded. This was what he had been confused about, what he had longed for even if he hadn't realized it. But just as the intensity grew, voices drifted from above, snapping them back to reality. They pulled apart, both of them gasping for air. The weight of what had just happened hung between them. Wamba's eyes were wide, his heart racing. Danso's expression was unreadable, his chest rising and falling as he stared at Wamba. Prince Danso, regaining his composure, called out for help. Voices from above responded. When they were finally pulled out of the ravine by the other students, the cold night air hit them, snapping the spell that had held them captive. The 2 hours allotted for the hunt were over. As they followed the other students back, Wamba reached out to Danso instinctively, his hand brushing against Danso's arm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice still shaky from the kiss, his concern genuine despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside him. Danso turned and slapped Wamba's hand away with a venomous glare. "Don't touch me," he spat in a low whisper so the others wouldn't hear, his voice thick with fury and shame. "What happened in there was all your fault. If you ever touch me again, I'll make sure you regret it. I don't know what those dads of yours have been teaching you, but don't bring it near me again." Danso stormed off after that, leaving Wamba standing there, confused and hurt. How could Danso go back to being his old self after what had just happened between them? How could he act like the kiss hadn't just torn something open between them? And being told not to bring it near him again after what had just transpired between them cut deeper than any insult. Wamba watched him leave with a sinking heart. His lips were still tingling from their kiss, the memory of their closeness still burning in his mind. How could he feel this way about someone who despised him so much? Someone who thought he was disgusting. The confusion and hurt gnawed at him, especially because the kiss had been mutual. Danso had wanted it too. So why was he blaming Wamba for something they had both participated in? Wamba replayed the scene over and over in his head. He hated how much he still wanted to kiss Danso, even after everything. Because what did that say of him? Where did that leave him? What now? This storm brewing between them, the fire that had ignited in the darkness, what would become of it? Danso stormed into his private dorm room, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that echoed through the empty halls. His breath came in ragged gasps. The memory of Wamba's kiss still lingered in his mind, stirring emotions he couldn't suppress, no matter how hard he tried. He moved to the center of the room, his fists trembling at his sides as unfamiliar emotions rushed through his body, a fire he couldn't control. Without warning, he let out a guttural cry, grabbing the nearest object, a chair, and flinging it to the side. His body trembled with fury as he tore at the room around him, pulling down tapestries and knocking over shelves. But even as the room descended into chaos, it wasn't enough to quell the storm inside him. "I can't," he muttered, pacing frantically, his voice hoarse. "I can't be this." The words felt like poison in his mouth. His mind raced with images of his father's face, stern, cold, unyielding. What would he think? Danso had been raised to be the perfect prince, the future king of the wealthiest kingdom in Africa. A man destined to lead, to command, to be invincible. But now, all of that was crumbling. He dropped to his knees, hands clutching his head, torn between who he was and who he was told to be. His father's voice echoed in his mind. A man who had passed laws criminalizing love, condemning anyone who dared to feel the way Danso did tonight. He knew the cruelty of those laws, saw the injustice of men rotting in dungeons for a crime that wasn't a crime at all. But he couldn't shake the fear that his father would see him the same way. Danso's chest tightened painfully. His father had no room for weakness, no space for anything less than absolute perfection in his only son. If he finds out, Danso's thoughts spiraled into darkness. He could already hear the condemnation in his father's voice, see the disgust in his eyes. There would be no mercy, no understanding. Tears welled in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "I can't be this," he thought again, his hands trembling as he wiped his face roughly. "I can't." But deep down, some part of him knew that he was, that this wasn't wrong, that it was the fear talking, not his heart. He looked to the sky, his heart twisting in desperation as he whispered to the gods, "Please, take this away from me. I beg you, don't let me be like this." His voice cracked, raw with the weight of his plea. "Make me strong. I'll do anything. Just take it away. Take this pain away from me. I beg you, don't let me feel this torment. I don't know how to handle it." But the gods remained silent. His fists tightened against the cold stone floor, and tears finally slipped free, streaking down his face as he sobbed quietly into the darkness. He couldn't understand it. His body, his mind, everything inside him was at war. When Wamba kissed him, a part of him had wanted more, despite the fear it caused. The emotions that surged through him took him by surprise, leaving him both exhilarated and terrified, struggling to make sense of what he felt. His lips had moved on instinct, drawn to Wamba like a force beyond his control, leaving him shaken by the depth of his emotions. And now he was lost, unable to reconcile his feelings with the fear that followed. He hated the part of him that lost control, the part of him that let feelings win. He had been raised to be in control of everything, to never act on emotion, to always think before he acted. But with Wamba there was no control, no reason, just chaos. Why did the gods bring him into my life? Danso's thoughts were a tangled mess, his heart aching. If Wamba had never come, none of this would be happening. I wouldn't be this. He fell to the floor, crumpling into himself, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Please," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "Please don't let me be like this. Don't make me fall for him. I'll do anything. Just make it stop." The silence was deafening, and in that moment, Danso felt utterly broken, his body trembling, his heart aching in ways he had never known before. Wamba stood under the shade of a tree in the courtyard, his eyes fixated on Prince Danso as he walked down the path, surrounded by his usual group of friends. It had been weeks since that night in the forest, the night they kissed, and yet the memory of it haunted Wamba with every waking moment. The feel of Danso's lips on his, the brief but electrifying touch of their skin, the intensity of their closeness. It all replayed in his mind like a melody he couldn't escape. Wamba's heart raced as he watched the prince, unable to tear his gaze away. Danso's friends were laughing and talking, but Danso, he remained silent, as always, his posture stiff, his expression as cold and unyielding as stone. Wamba couldn't help but wonder, does Danso ever smile? The thought tugged at him, what would Danso look like if he did? If the hardness in his features melted away, revealing something softer, something real. He'd be beautiful, Wamba thought, his chest tightening at the realization. He already is beautiful. Danso was a paradox. His beauty was undeniable. The sharp lines of his jaw, the dark intensity of his eyes, the way his skin seemed to glow under the sun. But how could someone so beautiful be so cruel? How could the person who stirred such longing in Wamba's heart also be the source of his deepest pain? Just then, as if sensing Wamba's gaze, Danso turned his head. Their eyes met, if only for a moment. But just as quickly, Danso looked away, his face tightening with a familiar coldness. Without a word, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, his friends oblivious to the quiet storm brewing between them. Wamba's heart sank. He had lost count of how many times this had happened, how many times Danso had seen him and immediately fled, as if Wamba's very presence was something to be avoided at all costs. Each time, it hurt more than Wamba wanted to admit. Why does he hate me so much? He thought back to that day in the forest, the moment their lips had met in a rush of confusion and desire. It was the day everything changed for Wamba. Beneath all the anger, beneath the urge to fight and push back, there was an undeniable attraction between them, something deep, intense, and impossible to ignore. Wamba sighed, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He couldn't help it. He was falling for his enemy. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how impossible it seemed, Wamba had stopped fighting it. One morning, as Wamba made his way to class, he saw Danso walking down the hall alone. His usual group of friends was nowhere to be seen. Wamba's pulse quickened as he watched Danso drop his handkerchief, the delicate fabric fluttering to the ground. This is my chance, Wamba thought, before he sees me. He hurried forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Just as he bent to pick up the handkerchief, Danso did the same. Their hands collided, and for a split second, they were touching, skin against skin. Wamba's breath caught in his throat as he looked up into Danso's eyes. Danso's reaction was immediate. He jerked back as if he had been burned, his face twisting in anger and panic. "Don't touch me," he spat, his voice sharp and trembling with barely contained emotion. Wamba's heart shattered. "Danso, we need to talk," he pleaded, his voice soft, almost desperate. "There's nothing to talk about," Danso hissed, standing tall and rigid, his eyes blazing with fear and fury. "Don't call me by my name. It's your highness to you. We are nothing to each other." With that, Danso turned and stormed away, leaving Wamba standing alone, the handkerchief still clutched in his hand. Wamba watched him go, feeling the weight of his heart breaking all over again. What do I do with these feelings? Days passed, and Danso continued to avoid him, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing moment. Wamba didn't know what to do anymore. His emotions were twisted in knots, his heart torn between wanting to be near Danso and the crushing pain of being pushed away. He had no one to talk to, no one to confide in. I wish I could talk to my dads, he thought, the ache of isolation weighing on him. They would understand. They would know what to do. But here, in this school, surrounded by whispers and judgment, Wamba felt more alone than ever. The weight of silence pressed down on him. He had heard the cruel words spoken in the halls, the judgment passed on people like his father's. And now, he was part of that same silence, struggling with feelings he couldn't speak of, not to anyone. When the invitation came to play the ngoni at an upcoming school event, theater night, Wamba hesitated. He hadn't played much since that night in the forest. His mind had been too full, his heart too heavy. But maybe this was what he needed, an escape from the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed him. The students were buzzing with excitement in the days leading up to the event, eager for the performances and the chance to unwind with friends. On the night of the event, the hall was filled with students and teachers, the air buzzing with excitement. Wamba stood backstage, his palms sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear applause after the play currently on stage, the sound making his nerves tingle as his turn approached. Normally, he thrived in moments like these, loved being in front of people, loved performing. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, his eyes sought out a single face in the crowd. Danso. There he was, sitting in the front row, beautiful as ever, his gaze locked on Wamba the moment Wamba walked to the stage. But it wasn't a look of admiration or curiosity. It was a glare, cold, hard, and unrelenting. Wamba's stomach twisted in knots. Why does he always have this effect on me? He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the soft fabric of Danso's handkerchief. He had meant to return it, but now it felt like the only connection he had left to the boy who consumed his every thought. As Wamba began to play the ngoni, his fingers moving deftly across the strings, something shifted inside him. The music flowed, but tonight it wasn't enough. The melody stirred something deep within him, a need to express what words had failed to convey. He found himself incorporating spoken word with the beats his fingers produced, like he had seen his late father do when he sang in the streets for money. Wamba remembered a particular story told by his father on several occasions to the people he played for. It was the tale of a tragic love, and the words now spilled from Wamba's lips of their own accord as the sound of the ngoni filled the room. In this tale, a young man stood outside his lover's door, pleading to be let in, desperate for the warmth of his lover's embrace. The man spoke of his heart through the closed door, heavy with unspoken feelings, of the coldness that had settled around him, of a love that could never be. As Wamba's words echoed through the hall, his eyes found Danso's once again. The prince was glaring at him, but there was something else there too, something Wamba couldn't quite read. Wamba's voice lowered as he neared the story's end, the tale's sorrow heavy in the room. Though the words belonged to the man in the tale, Wamba was speaking directly to Danso through the story. What do I do with all these feelings I have for you? Danso's face twisted, his expression unreadable. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he stormed out of the room, leaving Wamba standing on the stage, the final notes of the song still hanging in the air. The applause came soon after, but it meant nothing. All Wamba could think of was the empty seat in the front row, and the prince who had once filled it. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Episode 3 is coming out next week. In the meantime, I'd love to hear from you. What was your first love like? Over the years, I've had great conversations with people about their first love experiences, and it's always fascinating to hear about different experiences, whether they were sweet, funny, or even a little awkward. Being a teenager can be confusing, right? Please feel free to share your first love story in the comments below. I think we can all learn from each other's experiences. Let's keep it kind and respectful. I'm really looking forward to reading what you have to share.